So I just wondered, Kenny, like, what is your favorite type of data or statistics to look at? Do you have a couple or one in particular, going into a fantasy hockey season, or, a couple in particular to give advice on and that sort of thing?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I do have a couple, but I've combined them all into my data draft player hubs. So I now have the player hub and the goaltending hub, which I didn't have at the draft, but I try to keep it as simple as possible. A lot of times, like, especially with analytics guys, they get down in the weeds and they're looking at Corsi and expected percentages and all this stuff. And sometimes that does tell you something about a player. But I find that that's more useful for like teams that are making decisions on whether or not they need a sixth defenseman that moves the puck or hits or whatever. For fantasy, it comes down to numbers. It comes down to like who's producing. And so I keep it simple. Usually for forwards, I'll use goals above and below expected. I'll use the same thing for goaltending. I like to look for goaltending specifically. Little like key secret that I use is trying to make sure that your goaltender is on a really like top 10 defensive team, because a goaltender like John Gibson is a really, really skilled goalie, but he's getting 38 to 45 shots a game. And if you have like volume where you're getting points for saves, that helps, but otherwise he's unownable. And so he's a good goaltender that you'd think he's got the name value and you're going to pick him and it'll be fine. And then he ends up getting shelled. He's given up, I think it's 5 goals or more 13 times this year out of like 36 games. So the team defense matters a lot. I just mentioned today that Aiden Hill, as Thompson gets hurt, Aiden Hill is a huge guy to pick up because Vegas is number 2 in expected goals against right now. They're a very solid defensive team. Bruce Cassidy does a really good job, did a good job in Boston, now comes over to Vegas and he's doing the same thing. So I try to keep the data as simple as possible, but then, in I think it was November, December, I combined all the stuff that I look at and put it into the player hub and into the goalie hub. And it just gives you a sense. The player hub is mainly designed for category leagues where you don't have a numerical like value that you can compare players with. So I kind of created that value for you, and you can compare players with the comparison tool and whatnot. With goaltending, it factors in goals saved above expected, the team defensive performance, and then the general like save percentage, the amount of starts you get, the amount of wins you get. So you can kind of if your league has a point weighting for wins or whatever, you can fade a guy that doesn't get a lot of starts and go for the guy with volume. Or if you're in a different situation in a categories league with save percentage, you can look for guys like that. But I try not to get I try to bring the data to people without confusing them with it. So that's why I tried to make my own data tool so that people can get the tools that I'm using for the channel so they know exactly how to use it, and then it doesn't get too confusing.
And Kenny, just a quick follow-up to that. How do you feel about the direction of data and where it's going and the use of it as it continues to grow in hockey?
There's a ton. I just saw somebody sent me on LinkedIn like game data, and it's you look at the JSON file, which is like where you're getting a lot of the raw data, and then you have to then put a table on that or whatever, like use it somehow. But it's just massive. They're quantifying every single aspect of the game at this point, and I think the league just this year put in those cameras at the top of the rinks to have like they're essentially sensors to get this is a shot on goal from this point on the ice and whatnot. And it's getting to be a point where there's analytics teams that are growing just to handle that kind of data, not necessarily for hockey decisions, just to be able to like manage it, wrangle it, and then provide that to their hockey people. So it's a lot to work with, and then especially for what I do, like it's too much to work with because not a lot of people have a lot of time for fantasy. So I'm trying to distill even the simple data that I use to something that they can handle on a regular basis. But in terms of the game, like it's growing the fandom. I can see like Jay Fresh on Twitter has a ton of people following him and looking at the advanced data and whatnot. People have an appetite for it. But then in terms of the game itself, I think it is changing the game. I watched MSG and Stephen Valaket on there. He's the president CEO of ClearSight Analytics, and some of the insights that he's talking about, like the Royal Road passes, you have a 33% chance of scoring if you go across the slot line once. You have a 60-something% chance if it goes back again. So like stuff like that, I think they're starting to implement that with teams and talk to teams and say, look, these are the odds. If you want to play more of an East-West game, this will open up your offense or whatever. I'm a Rangers fan, so I think they they do a little too much of that, but nonetheless, it's still it's actionable insights that you can get from data and then use it on the ice, and it's something that we haven't really had until like the last like 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we're talking about all of these new innovations in data when it comes to hockey, it's kind of crazy because I would imagine that the teams themselves have way more access to this kind of stuff and have their own internal data teams that we just don't know about. And so I would love to be a fly on the wall in a data room for, say, one of the big teams like Colorado or Toronto or Tampa Bay, a big data team, right? That would be great. You know, because I'm titling this episode, How to Become a Better Fantasy Hockey Manager, and we were talking about the Data Draft Player Hub that you created and all of the advanced stats that go into your fantasy decision making. I just wanted to know, like, where do you pull your data from? Like, which websites are your go-to and maybe most accessible for people at home who want to get better at fantasy hockey? You know, aside from your tool that you've built, where does that data come from?
So one of the things that I look for, so I use a couple different sources. In the preseason, I was using mainly RotoWire and Quant Hockey. Quant is really good because you can type in specific dates. So if I'm looking for a player and how they've produced since a coaching change or in the second half or whatever, you can type in the specific dates and look up how that player did over a certain stretch. And that's really helpful for like trend videos and trying to, you know, understand how a player plays in certain months or whatever. Like I said, after a coaching change, Brock Besser's been playing a lot better after that coaching change. So Quant Hockey, RotoWire. I still use RotoWire for some things. And then obviously Money Puck. I just don't use Money Puck a ton. I use it mainly for like one or two things, the goals above expected, the team goals above expected, things like that. But Money Puck is a really good data source. I also use hockeyreference.com. They give really good split data. So you can find month by month, like how the players producing. You can find how they do at home versus on the road, things like that. And for me, that is starting to come into handy now that I'm playing daily fantasy. Another tool that I use I use it every day is statmuse.com/ask. You can literally just type in, you know, this player versus Minnesota, and they'll give you the stats of that player versus Minnesota. So I use that a lot for daily fantasy. And I try to use that, you know, if a player, you know, has a really good record like Crosby against the Islanders, you're going to want to have him in your daily fantasy lineup. So that's pretty much how I build my daily fantasy lineup, is seeing how they produce against other teams that they're playing that night. But yeah, so I use StatMuse for that kind of thing. I use Money Puck as one or two elements of both my player hubs, and then it's RotoWire, Quant, Hockey Reference. Those are the main go-tos that I use.